Before diving into these forgotten seekers of history's shadows, imagine a defeat so catastrophic that Rome tried to erase it from memory forever. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Tonight, we journey to 105 BCE, where two Roman armies faced annihilation at Arausio. This is the story Rome never wanted told, a tale of pride, betrayal, and one of history's bloodiest defeats.
The morning mist clung to the Rhine valley as Marcus Malleus Maximus adjusted his scarlet cloak, the fabric heavy with morning dew. His weathered hands gripped the ivory baton of command, knuckles white against the polished surface. At 53, he had seen countless battles, but never had he felt the weight of Rome's expectations so heavily upon his shoulders. The Germanic tribes were stirring beyond the river, their war chants echoing across the water like thunder before a storm. Behind him, 30,000 Roman legionnaires stood in perfect formation, their bronze armor catching the first rays of dawn. The eagle standards gleamed with fresh polish, and the centurions barked orders in the crisp morning air. Marcus had spent months drilling these men, transforming farmers and city dwellers into Rome's finest war machine, yet something gnawed at his mind. Reports of another army approaching from the south. Quintus Servilius Caepio, his rival, commanded equal numbers and bore the same authority. 2 consuls, 2 armies, 1 battlefield. Marcus touched the amulet at his throat. A gift from his wife before he departed Rome. The gods would decide their fate this day. Quintus Servilius Caepio spurred his black stallion up the muddy hillside, his purple cloak snapping in the autumn wind. At 41, he carried himself with the arrogance of noble birth, his clean-shaven jaw set in perpetual disdain. The golden torque around his neck proclaimed his victories in Hispania, each twisted band representing a conquered tribe. His army moved like a great serpent through the valleys south of Arausio. 35,000 men in column formation, the youngest soldiers sang marching songs, their voices carrying across the countryside, while veterans remained silent, eyes scanning the horizon for threats. Caepio's lips curled into a cold smile as scouts brought news of Marcus's position ahead. "The fool thinks he can claim glory without me," Caepio muttered to his aide, a thin man who nodded eagerly at his commander's words. The aide carried a leather satchel filled with wax tablets, messages from Rome demanding swift action against the Germanic threat. But Caepio had his own plans, ones that would ensure his name alone graced the victory scrolls. The stallion snorted, breath visible in the cold air, as Caepio pulled the reins tight. Power was everything in Rome, and he would not share it with a lesser man like Marcus. Boiorix stood atop the sacred grove's highest oak, his massive frame silhouetted against the grey sky. The Cimbri chieftain's blonde hair fell past his shoulders, braided with iron rings that clinked softly in the breeze. Intricate blue tattoos covered his bare chest, telling the story of his people's long journey from the frozen Northlands. His pale blue eyes surveyed the Roman camps below, calculating numbers and weaknesses with the cunning of a born warrior. Around the grove, 40,000 Cimbri warriors prepared for battle. Women wove protective charms into their husbands' hair, while children too young to fight sharpened arrowheads with focused determination. The elderly druids chanted ancient verses, calling upon Chieftain, the god of war, to grant them victory over the southern invaders. Boiorix's weathered hands gripped his iron-headed spear, its shaft carved with runes that promised death to enemies. He had led his people for 12 years, through famine and plenty, always moving southward in search of fertile lands. The Romans stood between them and their destiny. But today, that would change. A raven landed on a nearby branch, its black eyes meeting Boiorix's gaze. Among his people, ravens were messengers from the gods, and this one brought news of victory. The chieftain's lips curved into a predatory smile as he climbed down from his perch. The war council tent reeked of oil lamps and nervous sweat as Marcus spread the leather maps across the wooden table. His fingers traced the winding path of the Rhone River, marking enemy positions with small lead tokens. The tent flaps rustled in the evening breeze, and shadows danced on the canvas walls as his officers leaned closer to study the battle plans. The Germanic host numbers near 80,000, reported Lucius Aurelius, his chief scout, a man whose face bore the scars of countless reconnaissance missions. They've established camps along both sides of the river, using the high ground to their advantage. His calloused finger pointed to several key positions on the map, each marking a potential disaster. Marcus nodded grimly, his weathered features etched with concern. The mathematics of war were simple. They were outnumbered nearly 2-1. Yet Roman discipline and superior tactics had overcome such odds before. He thought of Caesar's commentaries studied in his youth, where smaller forces triumphed through cunning and coordination. A horn sounded in the distance, 3 long blasts that meant another messenger approached. Marcus looked up from the maps, his brown eyes reflecting the lamplight. Time was running short, and every decision made in this tent would determine whether Rome's eagles returned home in triumph or remained buried in foreign soil. Caepio dismissed his war council with an impatient wave, sending his officers stumbling from the tent into the darkness. Alone except for his faithful aide Gaius, he paced the confines of his quarters like a caged wolf. The bronze brazier cast shifting shadows on the tent walls, and the scent of burning charcoal filled the air. His purple cloak lay discarded on a camp stool, revealing the muscled torso beneath his linen tunic. "Send word to Marcus," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of generations of noble blood. "Tell him I have arrived and will assume overall command of both armies." His aide scratched notes onto a wax tablet with practiced speed, the stylus making soft scratching sounds in the quiet tent. Gaius looked up nervously, his thin face pale in the firelight. "Sir, the law grants equal authority to both consuls. Perhaps a joint command would be more appropriate." The suggestion hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that could reshape the coming battle. Caepio's eyes flashed dangerously, and his hand moved instinctively to his sword hilt. Joint command breeds confusion and defeat. Rome needs one voice, one will, one leader. He turned toward the tent entrance, where guards stood silently at attention. "Prepare my ceremonial armor. Tomorrow, I meet with this Marcus and settle matters of precedence." The pre-dawn silence shattered as Cimbri war horns echoed across the valley, their deep bronze voices awakening both Roman camps. Boiorix stood before his assembled war chiefs, each man representing a different clan of his vast confederation. His bearskin cloak draped over broad shoulders, and the morning frost glittered on his blonde beard like scattered diamonds. "Determined. Today, we feast in Valhalla or claim Roman lands as our own," he declared, his voice carrying across the gathered warriors. The men roared approval, spears and shields clashing in rhythm that seemed to shake the very earth. Behind them, the Cimbri women began their death songs, haunting melodies that promised vengeance for fallen husbands and sons. Boiorix, his trusted war chief, approached with news from their spies within the Roman camps. The grizzled warrior's face bore ritual scars that marked his status among the tribe, and his grey eyes held the wisdom of countless battles. Satisfied, the southern Romans refused to coordinate with the northern army, he reported with satisfaction. "Their pride will be their doom." Boiorix nodded approvingly, his pale eyes scanning the Roman positions visible in the distance. Divided enemies were vulnerable enemies, a lesson learned from generations of tribal warfare. He raised his iron-headed spear toward the lightning sky, and 40,000 voices answered with a war cry that froze the blood of listening Romans. Marcus received Caepio's message as he broke his fast with barley porridge and watered wine. The wax tablet felt cold in his hands as he read the younger consul's demands, each word a calculated insult to his experience and authority. His jaw tightened, and the wooden spoon snapped between his fingers, porridge scattering across the small camp table. "The arrogance of youth," he muttered, showing the tablet to his aide Titus, a grizzled veteran who had served 3 consuls before Marcus. Titus read the message twice, his scarred features darkening with each line. The tent fell silent except for the crackling of the morning fire and distant sounds of the camp awakening. Outside, trumpets announced the changing of the guard, and Marcus could hear his centurions beginning morning drill. 30,000 men depended on his leadership, men who trusted him to bring them home alive. He thought of his wife, Claudia, waiting in their villa outside Rome, tending her garden while praying for his safe return. "Send reply," Marcus decided, rising from his chair with practiced military bearing. "Tell Quintus that I welcome coordination, but will not subordinate Roman citizens to personal ambition." He reached for his scarlet cloak, knowing that this day would test more than his military skills. Pride and politics were deadlier enemies than any Germanic tribe. Wind picked up as Capio read Marcus's reply, the papyrus crackling in his grip like dry autumn leaves. His face flushed red with indignation, and the golden torque at his throat seemed to tighten with his rising anger. Around his tent, servants moved quietly, polishing armor and sharpening weapons with the efficiency born of long practice. "Insubordination!" he hissed through clenched teeth, crushing the message in his fist. His aide, Gaius, stepped back instinctively, having learned to recognize the signs of his commander's explosive temper. The younger man's pale hands trembled as he prepared fresh wax tablets for correspondence. Through the tent opening, Capio could see his legions preparing for battle, their movements precise and disciplined. These men represented the finest training Rome could provide, and he would not see them led by a commoner's son who had bought his consulship with grain subsidies and popular appeals. "Cumding, summon my war council," Capio commanded, his voice carrying the chill of winter wind. "We march independently. If Marcus wishes to cling to obsolete notions of shared command, let him face the barbarians alone." He turned to his personal armor rack, where his finest ceremonial breastplate waited, its silver surface etched with scenes of previous victories. The tribal council gathered in the sacred grove as the sun reached its zenith, filtering through ancient oak leaves to cast dancing shadows on the forest floor. Boiorix sat on a throne carved from a single massive tree trunk, its surface worn smooth by generations of chieftains. Around him, the war leaders of allied tribes formed a circle, their weapons and jewelry glinting in the dappled sunlight. Ariovistus of the Teutones spoke first, his voice carrying the authority of 70 winters. The old chief's white beard reached his belt, and his blind left eye, lost in battle decades ago, gave him a prophetic appearance. Solemn. "The omens favor war," he intoned, casting carved bone fragments onto a deer hide. "The ravens speak of Roman blood watering our new lands." Younger chiefs murmured agreement, their hands moving instinctively to sword hilts and spear shafts. Behind them, the sounds of the great camp continued, children playing war games, women preparing weapons, and smiths hammering iron on their anvils. The acrid smell of forge fires mixed with the earthy scent of the forest floor. Boiorix studied the bone fragments, reading patterns invisible to Roman eyes. His pale gaze lifted to meet those of his war chiefs, and a slow smile spread across his bearded face. Determined, "Then today we claim our destiny," he declared, rising from the ancient throne, commanding, "Send word to all clans. We attack at the next moon's rising." Marcus stood atop the earthen ramparts of his camp, watching the Germanic host assemble across the valley. The enemy moved like a vast river of humanity, their numbers seeming to multiply with each passing hour. Banners and standards rose above the throng, bearing symbols that predated Rome's founding by centuries. The afternoon sun glinted off countless spearheads and shield bosses, creating a sea of deadly light. Below him, his own soldiers worked frantically to strengthen their defenses. Engineers directed the construction of additional earthworks, while supply officers distributed arrows and javelins from carefully guarded stores. The familiar sounds of military preparation filled the air, hammering, shouting, and the rhythmic tramp of marching feet. "Sir!" reported his aide Titus, climbing the wooden steps to join him on the rampart. Scouts confirm the enemy plans to attack before dawn. They're performing ritual sacrifices. Our men can hear the chanting from here. Thoughtful, the older man's weathered face showed no fear, only the grim determination of a veteran who had survived 20 years of warfare. Marcus nodded, his brown eyes never leaving the enemy formations. Somewhere beyond that host, Caepio commanded another Roman army, but distance and pride had made coordination impossible. Tonight, each consul would face the Germanic fury alone, with only their soldiers' courage and Rome's military tradition as shields against annihilation. The moon hung like a silver coin against the star-scattered sky as Caepio paced his tent, unable to sleep. Reports from his forward scouts painted an increasingly grim picture. The Germanic Confederation had grown beyond all previous estimates. His fingers drummed against his sword hilt, a nervous habit developed during his campaigns in Hispania. Through the tent walls, he could hear the measured tread of sentries and the low conversations of soldiers on watch duty. These sounds, once comforting, now seemed ominous in the face of tomorrow's battle. His aide Gaius entered quietly, carrying a steaming cup of honeyed wine and the latest dispatches from Rome. The Senate's latest orders, sir, Gaius announced, setting the cup on the campaign table beside maps and tactical scrolls. They demand swift action against the barbarian threat. Anxious, the young man's voice carried an edge of worry that even military discipline couldn't completely suppress. Caepio broke the seal on the dispatch, reading by the flickering light of oil lamps. The words were predictable. Senators who had never held a sword demanding impossible victories from commanders facing impossible odds. He crumpled the papyrus and tossed it into the brazier, watching senatorial wisdom transform into ash and smoke. Determined. Tomorrow we write our own history, he declared, raising the wine cup in a solitary toast. Rome will remember this day, whatever the outcome. Boiorix knelt before the sacred fire, its flames casting his tattooed features into sharp relief. The ritual blade in his hands gleamed with ceremonial oils, and the scent of burning herbs filled the forest clearing. Around him, druids chanted in the old tongue, their voices weaving spells of protection and victory that had sustained his people through countless migrations. The Germanic chieftain drew the blade across his palm, letting drops of blood fall into the flames. Each drop hissed and sparked, carrying his prayers to Tutatis and Wardan, the gods of war and wisdom. His pale eyes reflected the firelight as he spoke the ancient words, binding himself and his warriors to victory or death. Behind him, the great camp stirred with pre-battle energy. Warriors painted their faces with sacred symbols, while their women wove final charms and blessings. Children too young for battle gathered arrows and tended cooking fires, understanding that tomorrow would determine their people's fate for generations to come. Determined. Let the Romans taste fear, Boiorix intoned, rising from his knees with blood still dripping from his scarred palm. Gravely, let them know that northern winds bring winter's death to southern lands. He turned from the sacred fire to face his assembled war chiefs, each man's face painted with ritual colors that proclaimed their clan and courage. Dawn broke, grey and cold, over the valley of Arausio, the sun struggling through clouds that promised rain before nightfall. Marcus adjusted his bronze helmet, the horsehair crest damp with morning dew, and surveyed his battle line one final time. 30,000 Romans stood in perfect formation, their red shields locked together like scales on some great serpent of war. The Germanic host had moved during the night, positioning themselves between the two Roman armies with strategic cunning that spoke of experienced leadership. Through the morning mist, Marcus could see their standards, wolf heads, ravens, and ancient symbols that predated civilization itself. Their war chants echoed across the valley, growing louder as the light strengthened. "Remember your training," sternly, Marcus called to his centurions, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp air. "Rome watches today. Your ancestors watch today. Let no man say the legions failed when the Republic needed them most. Determined, his words rippled through the ranks, stiffening spines and tightening grips on shields and weapons. Behind him, trumpeters waited with bronze instruments ready, while standard-bearers held the sacred eagles that embodied Rome's divine favor. The moment of decision approached like an avalanche, unstoppable and terrible in its finality. Marcus drew his sword, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard, and pointed toward the enemy host. The first Germanic war cry shattered the morning calm like thunder splitting the sky. Boiorix raised his iron-headed spear high above his head, and 40,000 voices answered with a roar that seemed to shake the earth itself. Behind him, the Great Confederation began its advance, a tide of humanity flowing down the valley slopes toward the isolated Roman armies. Warriors ran naked from the waist up despite the cold, their bodies painted with protective symbols and ritual scars. Shield walls formed and reformed as different tribes found their positions, the diversity of Germanic peoples united by common purpose. Spears bristled like a forest of iron, and the thunder of feet on frozen ground grew louder with each passing moment. Today we take Roman lands, Boiorix bellowed, his voice carrying over the din of advancing warriors. Today we avenge our ancestors and secure our children's future. The spear in his hands seemed to pulse with supernatural energy, as if the gods themselves had blessed his cause. From his position at the front of the charge, he could see both Roman armies clearly. Marcus held the northern position with disciplined legions, while Caepio's forces occupied the southern approach. The Germanic strategy was simple but devastating. Crush each army separately before they could coordinate their defense. Caepio heard the Germanic war cry from his position 3 miles south, the sound carrying across the valley like the voice of doom itself. His purple cloak snapped in the wind as he wheeled his black stallion to face his assembled legions. 35,000 men stood ready, their armor polished and weapons sharp, but uncertainty clouded many faces at the distant sounds of battle. "Stand firm," Caepio commanded, his voice cutting through the morning air with aristocratic authority. "Whatever befalls our fellow Romans, we hold this ground until ordered otherwise." His words carried confidence his heart didn't feel, but leadership demanded the appearance of certainty, even in the face of disaster. Through the morning mist, he could see movement on the northern battlefield, where Marcus faced the main Germanic assault. Dust clouds rose into the grey sky, punctuated by flashes of metal and the distant sounds of combat. Every instinct screamed at him to march north and combine forces, but pride had built walls that even approaching catastrophe couldn't breach. His aide Gaius rode up with reports from forward scouts, the young man's face pale with the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Sir, the barbarians number at least 80,000. They've engaged Marcus in force while sending flanking columns toward our position." The words hung in the air like funeral incense, heavy with implications that chilled the blood. The Germanic tide crashed into Marcus's line like a mountain avalanche striking a stone wall. Shields splintered and spears snapped as 40,000 screaming warriors collided with 30,000 disciplined Romans. The sound was indescribable. Metal on metal, wood on bronze, and the terrible chorus of men dying in agony and fury. Marcus fought in the front rank, his sword rising and falling in practiced rhythm as he cut down painted warriors who seemed to feel no fear of death. Blood sprayed across his bronze breastplate, some his own, from a spear thrust that had penetrated his shoulder guard. Around him, his centurions roared orders that were barely audible over the din of battle. "Hold the line!" he shouted, parrying a war axe that would have taken his head. "For Rome! For the Eagles!" His words were taken up by nearby legionnaires, creating pockets of resistance that stood firm against the barbarian flood. But the sheer weight of numbers was telling. Germanic warriors simply climbed over their own dead to reach Roman shields. The legion's Aquila, its golden eagle gleaming even in the grey morning light, swayed dangerously as barbarians pressed closer to the sacred standard. Marcus saw the danger and fought his way toward the eagle bearer, knowing that losing the standard would mean losing the battle. Every step cost blood, both Roman and Germanic, painting the frozen ground crimson.
Boiorix carved his way through Roman ranks like lightning splitting an oak tree, his iron-headed spear reaping lives with each thrust. The battle fury was upon him, and rational thought fled before the red mist of combat. Romans fell before his advance, their bronze armor no match for Germanic steel driven by supernatural strength. "Death to the invaders!" he roared, pulling his spear from a centurion's chest, before pivoting to block a gladius thrust. The Roman blade skittered off his iron armband, and his return strike opened the legionnaire's throat in a spray of arterial blood. All around him, his warriors pressed forward with similar ferocity, driven by generations of hatred for Roman oppression. The painted chieftain could see the golden eagle of Marcus's legion, the sacred standard that represented Roman power and divine favor. Capturing it would break Roman morale and send shockwaves through the empire itself. He fought toward it with single-minded purpose, leaving a trail of bodies in his wake. Behind him, Germanic horns sounded the advance of fresh reserves, thousands of warriors who had not yet tasted battle. The Romans were already exhausted from the initial assault, their careful formations breaking down into desperate individual combats. Victory was within reach, but Boiorix knew that battles could turn on a single moment of courage or cowardice. The Roman line bent like a bow under Germanic pressure, centurions falling back step by bloody step while maintaining what discipline they could. Marcus reached the eagle-bearer just as a painted warrior's axe split the man's skull, sending the sacred standard tumbling toward the frozen ground. Without hesitation, the consul grabbed the eagle's wooden shaft, raising it high above the chaos. "Rally on me," he bellowed, his voice somehow carrying over the battle's din. "The eagle stands! Rome stands!" Legionnaires who had been wavering found fresh courage in their commander's defiance, forming a desperate circle around the precious standard. Their shields locked together, creating a small island of resistance in the barbarian flood. But Marcus could see the hopelessness of their situation. His shoulder wound had reopened, soaking his tunic with blood, and exhaustion weighed on his sword arm like chains. Around the eagle's defensive circle, Germanic warriors pressed closer, their painted faces twisted with battle fury and the certainty of victory. Through the melee, he caught glimpses of Boiorix advancing like some ancient god of war, the barbarian chieftain's spear claiming Roman lives with each thrust. The two leaders' eyes met across the battlefield, and Marcus saw his own death reflected in those pale blue orbs. Yet still he held the eagle high, determined that it would not fall, while breath remained in his body. 3 miles south, Capio watched smoke rise from the northern battlefield while struggling with the greatest decision of his military career. His scouts reported that Marcus's army was being destroyed, the disciplined legions crumbling before the Germanic assault, like sand before an ocean wave. Honor demanded that he march to his fellow consul's aid, but pragmatism whispered that doing so would only add his army to the casualty lists. "Sir, we must act now if we're to save anything from this disaster," urged his senior centurion, a grizzled veteran named Brutus who had served in Gaul for 20 years. The older man's scarred face showed no emotion, but his white knuckles on his vine stick betrayed his inner turmoil. "Every moment we delay costs Roman lives." Scipio stared at the distant battle, his noble features twisted with indecision. His purple cloak fluttered in the wind, and his golden torque seemed to tighten around his throat like a garrote. 35,000 men awaited his orders, their faces turned toward him with the blind trust that Roman discipline demanded. The young consul's black stallion pranced nervously, sensing its rider's internal struggle. In the distance, the sounds of combat grew fainter, suggesting that the battle was ending, and not in Rome's favor. Capio closed his eyes, knowing that history would judge whatever choice he made in this moment. The circle around the Roman eagle grew smaller with each passing moment as Germanic warriors pressed their attack. Marcus had taken 3 more wounds, a spear thrust to his thigh, an axe cut across his ribs, and a slingstone
that had cracked his helmet and left him dizzy with concussion. Yet still, he held the sacred standard aloft, its golden wings catching what little sunlight penetrated the battle's dust cloud. Only 24 legionnaires remained of his original formation, their shields locked in a final defensive square that grew tighter with each fallen comrade. These were veterans of 12 campaigns, men who understood that retreat was impossible, and surrender meant torture, followed by death. They would die as Romans, with weapons in their hands, and curses for their enemies on their lips. Boiorix appeared before the defensive circle like an avenging god, his iron-headed spear dark with Roman blood, and his tattooed chest heaving with exertion. The Germanic chieftain's pale eyes fixed on Marcus, recognizing in the wounded consul a worthy adversary who deserved an honorable death. Around them, the battle's roar faded to a deadly quiet, as warriors on both sides sensed the approaching climax.
"You fight well for a southern dog,"
Boiorix called out in broken Latin, his voice carrying genuine respect despite the insult.
"Surrender your eagle, and I will grant you a warrior's death."
His spear point never wavered from Marcus's chest, and his painted warriors formed a circle around the Roman square, waiting for their chieftain's command. Marcus spat blood from a cut lip, his brown eyes blazing with defiance despite his wounds.
"A Roman consul does not surrender sacred standards to barbarian dogs," he replied,
raising the eagle higher.
"Come and take it, if you dare."
The remaining legionnaires cheered weakly, their voices hoarse from battle cries and desperate prayers to gods who seemed to have abandoned them. Caepio made his choice as the sounds of battle faded to ominous silence in the north. "Signal the retreat," he commanded, his voice barely above a whisper. "We march for Massilia immediately." The words tasted like ash in his mouth, but the mathematics of survival were brutally simple. Marcus was already dead or dying, and adding his army to the casualty lists would serve no purpose. His aide Gaius stared in shock, the young man's face pale as parchment. "Sir, we abandon our fellow Romans to their fate." The question hung in the morning air like an accusation, and several nearby centurions exchanged meaningful glances. Roman military tradition demanded mutual support, and withdrawal in the face of battle was tantamount to cowardice. "I preserve what can be preserved," Caepio replied coldly, though his hands shook as he turned his stallion south. "Better that one army survives to fight another day than both perish in futile gesture." The logic was sound, but it felt hollow even to his own ears. Behind him, 35,000 legionnaires began their withdrawal, their eagle standards still gleaming, but their honor tarnished by retreat. The dust of their departure rose into the grey sky like smoke from a funeral pyre. In years to come, Caepio would claim that strategic withdrawal saved the army for future victories. But the truth was simpler and more damning. Pride had divided Roman forces, and pride now dictated their separate fates. The clash between Marcus and Boiorix lasted only heartbeats, but seemed to stretch across eternity. The Roman consul's gladius met the Germanic spear in a shower of sparks, steel ringing against iron in the ancient song of combat. Despite his wounds, Marcus fought with the skill of 20 years' experience, his blades seeking the gaps in his opponent's natural armor of muscle and bone. But Boiorix was younger, unwounded, and fighting for his people's survival rather than imperial glory. His spear thrust past Marcus's weakening guard, the iron point punching through bronze armor to find the consul's heart. Marcus gasped, blood frothing from his lips, as he looked down at the weapon protruding from his chest. "You fought with honor," Marcus whispered, his grip loosening on the eagle standard. The sacred symbol of Roman power wavered, then began to fall toward the frozen ground. Around the dying circle of legionnaires, Germanic warriors raised their voices in victory cries that echoed across the valley like thunder. Boiorix caught the falling eagle before it touched earth, his pale eyes showing respect for his fallen enemy. Quietly, "Your gods will welcome such courage," he said quietly, easing Marcus's body to the ground with surprising gentleness. The Roman consul's eyes fixed on the grey sky above, seeing perhaps the shades of ancestors welcoming him to the warrior's rest. The massacre that followed Marcus's death was swift and terrible. The surviving legionnaires, their commander fallen and their eagle captured, broke formation and fled in all directions. But Germanic warriors, drunk on victory and bloodlust, pursued them like wolves hunting scattered sheep. The frozen ground grew slick with Roman blood as 30,000 soldiers were cut down in their flight. Boiorix stood among the carnage, the captured eagle in his hands and the weight of victory heavy on his shoulders. Around him, his warriors stripped the dead of armor and weapons, while others began the grim work of counting heads for the ritual offerings to their gods. The air filled with smoke from funeral pyres and the cries of carrion birds drawn by the scent of death. "Send riders to all the clans," he commanded Boiorix, his trusted war chief who bore fresh wounds from the battle. "Tell them that Roman pride has purchased Roman destruction. Let the news spread south to their cities that they might know fear before we bring them fire and sword." The Germanic chieftain raised the captured eagle toward the grey sky, its golden wings reflecting the flames of burning Roman equipment. "Today, we have avenged our ancestors," he declared to his assembled warriors. "Tomorrow we claim the lands they died for." The roar of approval that answered him seemed to shake the very mountains. News of the northern disaster reached Caepio's retreating army by evening, carried by a handful of survivors who had escaped the Germanic pursuit. The messengers stumbled into camp covered in blood and mud, their eyes haunted by visions of slaughter that would torment them for the rest of their shortened lives. Their reports painted a picture of complete annihilation. 30,000 Romans dead, their consul fallen and their eagle captured. Caepio received the news in his command tent, his face a mask of aristocratic composure that concealed the turmoil within. His aide Gaius wept openly for the fallen legions, but the consul's training prevented such displays of emotion. Instead, he poured wine for the survivors and listened to their broken accounts of the battle's final moments. "Marcus died well," reported one survivor, a centurion whose right arm hung useless at his side. "He held the eagle to the enser, wouldn't surrender it to the barbarian chief." The man's voice broke as he described his commander's final stand, the image of Roman courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Outside the tent, Caepio's army prepared defensive positions for the night, their movements subdued by the knowledge that they were now alone in hostile territory. 35,000 men looked to their commander for salvation, unaware that his thoughts were focused not on their survival, but on how to explain this disaster to the Roman Senate. The Germanic Confederation celebrated their victory throughout the night, their fires visible for miles across the valley. Boiorix sat beside the largest bonfire, the captured Roman eagle planted in the earth beside his throne of victory. Warriors from a dozen tribes shared wine looted from Roman supplies and sang ancient songs of triumph that their grandfathers had taught them. The chieftain's thoughts, however, were already turning toward the future. One Roman army was destroyed, but another remained intact somewhere to the south. Moreover, the victory at Arausio, though complete, had cost his people dearly. Nearly 10,000 Germanic warriors lay dead among the Roman corpses, including many experienced fighters who could not be easily replaced. Boiorix approached with reports from scouts tracking the surviving Roman force. "They march south toward the Great Water," he informed his chief, settling beside the fire with a wine cup in his scarred hands. Thought, "Their commander shows no stomach for further battle, but his men are disciplined and dangerous if cornered." Boiorix nodded thoughtfully, his pale eyes reflecting the firelight as he considered options. The captured eagle would serve as a powerful symbol to unite other tribes against Rome, but symbols meant nothing without the strength to back them. His warriors needed time to rest and recover, while the surviving Romans needed time to spread word of their defeat throughout the empire. Dawn brought no relief to Capio's retreating legions, as Germanic scouts shadowed their march south toward Massilia. The consul rode at the column's head, his purple cloak dulled with road dust, and his face set in grim lines that spoke of sleepless nights and haunted dreams. Behind him, 35,000 men trudged through morning mist, their eagles still flying, but their morale shattered by the knowledge of their comrades' fate. The road stretched before them like a pale scar across the landscape, winding through valleys that seemed to hold barbarian shadows behind every tree and boulder. Supply wagons creaked along the route, their precious cargo of food and weapons guarded by nervous soldiers who jumped at every sound. The wounded from yesterday's survivors rode in carts, their groans providing a constant reminder of Roman mortality. "Sir, the scouts report movement in the hills," Gaius informed his commander, his young face aged by responsibility and fear. "Large groups of barbarians, but they maintain their distance. They seem content to watch our withdrawal rather than attack." His voice carried a note of puzzlement, as if he couldn't understand why the enemy showed such restraint. Capio understood all too well. Boiorix was no mere barbarian chieftain, but a strategist who knew the value of psychological warfare. Letting one Roman army escape would spread terror throughout the empire, more effectively than destroying both forces completely. Fear was a weapon sharper than any sword. The Germanic Confederation began to fragment as news of their victory spread throughout Gaul and Germania. Tribal leaders who had sworn allegiance to Boiorix now questioned whether they needed his leadership, their success having bred the arrogance that destroyed so many barbarian alliances. The Teutones spoke of returning to their traditional lands, while smaller clans argued over the distribution of Roman plunder. Boiorix faced the challenge that had destroyed greater chieftains before him. Maintaining unity after victory proved more difficult than achieving it through adversity. He stood before the assembled war council in his pavilion, the captured Roman eagle serving as a backdrop to his words. Around him, clan leaders who had fought as brothers now eyed each other with suspicion and greed. "The Romans will return," he warned, his voice cutting through the political chatter like a blade through silk. "They will come with more legions, better generals, and the fury of a wounded empire. Divided, we become prey for their vengeance. United, we can carve out a kingdom that will endure for our children's children." Ariovistus of the Teutones, his weathered face bearing fresh scars from the recent battle, shook his white-bearded head. "My people have followed you to victory, young wolf, but now they hunger for their own hearths. The Teutones will winter in their ancestral valleys, not in these southern lands that reek of Roman corruption." The first reports of the Arausio disaster reached Rome like wildfire, consuming dry timber, spreading panic through the streets and forums with terrifying speed. Citizens who had awakened to normal autumn mornings found themselves confronting the unthinkable. 2 consular armies destroyed, 65,000 citizens dead or missing, and barbarian hordes threatening the Republic's northern frontiers. In the Senate House, elderly patricians who remembered Hannibal's march on Rome felt their blood turn to ice water as messengers delivered increasingly grim reports. The chamber's marble columns and gilded decorations seemed to mock the assembled senators, symbols of wealth and power that meant nothing against Germanic steel and fury. Marcus Aemilius Scaurus, the princeps senatus and most respected voice in the chamber, rose slowly from his ivory chair. At 78 years old, he had weathered every crisis of his generation, but nothing had prepared him for disaster on this scale. His voice, still strong despite his age, echoed in the sudden silence as he spoke the words that every man present dreaded to hear. Somber. "Citizens of Rome," he began, his weathered hands gripping the podium with white-knuckled intensity. "Serious. We face the gravest threat to our republic since Brennus sacked this city 3 centuries ago. Grave. 2 armies are lost, 2 consuls fallen, and our northern borders lie open to barbarian invasion." The chamber erupted in shouting and lamentation, the sound of Roman composure finally cracking under unbearable pressure. Caepio's retreating army reached the port of Massilia as the sun set behind purple clouds that seemed to mirror the consul's tattered cloak. The Greek colony's white buildings glowed in the evening light, offering the promise of ships and safety to men who had marched in terror for 3 days. Behind them, the road stretched north toward a battlefield where 30,000 Romans lay feeding crows and wolves. The city's inhabitants lined the walls and harbour, their faces showing mixtures of fear and curiosity as they watched the bedraggled legions file through the gates. These were not the triumphant conquerors who had departed Rome, with eagles flying and trumpets blaring, but hollow-eyed survivors haunted by visions of slaughter and defeat. Caepio dismounted his black stallion in the forum, his legs unsteady after days in the saddle. Around him, centurions began the process of billeting exhausted soldiers in whatever accommodations the city could provide. The consul's aide, Gaius, approached with reports from the harbour master. Ships were available, but not enough to transport the entire army at once. Horse. "Send word to Rome immediately," Caepio commanded. Exhale, his voice hoarse from shouting orders over 3 days of retreat, determined. "Tell the Senate that I have preserved 1 army from total disaster and request immediate reinforcements." The lie came easily to his lips, but his reflection in a polished shield showed the truth. A man aged years in mere days by the weight of failure and shame. Winter settled over the valley of Arausio like a shroud, covering the battlefield where so many Romans had perished. Snow fell gently on scattered bones and rusted weapons, nature's way of concealing the evidence of human folly and Germanic fury. The crows and wolves had long since finished their grim feast, leaving only whitened skeletons to mark where Marcus Malleus Maximus had made his final stand. Boiorix stood alone in the sacred grove where he had first planned the battle, the captured Roman eagle planted in the frozen earth beside the ancient oak. The Confederation had scattered to winter quarters throughout Gaul, taking their plunder and their wounded to heal until spring brought new campaigns. The chieftain's breath misted in the cold air as he contemplated the empty battlefield and the challenges that lay ahead. Victory had come at a price higher than gold. His people were divided, his allies scattered, and the coming spring would surely bring Roman vengeance. Already, merchants travelling the trade routes brought rumours of new legions gathering in Italia, led by generals whose names struck fear even into barbarian hearts. The eagle at his feet represented not just triumph, but the eternal enmity of the world's greatest military power. "The gods give victory with one hand and responsibility with the other," he murmured to the winter wind, touching the ritual scars on his chest. The old druids had taught him that every triumph carried the seeds of future challenges, and Arausio would prove no exception to that ancient wisdom. The Senate's emergency session continued through the night, oil lamps casting flickering shadows on worried faces as Rome's leaders debated their response to the northern catastrophe. Messengers arrived hourly with fresh reports, some accurate, others distorted by fear and rumour. The confusion was nearly as damaging as the original defeat, creating uncertainty where decisive action was needed. Marcus Aemilius Scaurus had taken unofficial control of the proceedings, his age and experience commanding respect even from political rivals who might otherwise challenge his authority. Maps of Gaul covered the chamber's floor, marked with coloured pins showing barbarian movements and Roman defensive positions. The picture they painted was grim, a frontier in collapse and enemies advancing on multiple fronts. "We must recall Marius from Africa," argued Lucius Crassus.
a younger senator whose family had lost 3 relatives in the Arausio disaster. Whatever his political views, he remains our finest military mind. The suggestion sparked heated debate, as Marius represented the popular faction, while many present belonged to the optimates, who had opposed his previous consulships. Old Scaurus nodded slowly, recognizing political necessity despite personal reservations. "Pride is a luxury Rome can no longer afford," he declared, his voice cutting through partisan arguments. "Send envoys to Gaius Marius immediately. Tell him the Republic requires his services against the Germanic threat." The words tasted bitter, but survival demanded pragmatism over political purity. News of Rome's disaster spread throughout the Mediterranean world like ripples from a stone cast into still water. In Alexandria, Greek scholars who had long debated Roman military superiority suddenly found their arguments hollow. Egyptian merchants adjusted their trade routes to avoid potential barbarian raids, while Parthian ambassadors smiled behind their silk veils as they composed reports for their distant king. The Germanic victory resonated most strongly in Gaul itself, where tribal leaders who had submitted to Roman rule began to question their allegiances. Druids who had been forced underground emerged to proclaim the ancient prophecies fulfilled. The southern eagles had fallen before northern wolves, and the time of liberation was at hand. In the hilltop settlement of Gergovia, a young Arverni nobleman named Vercingetorix listened to his father's war chief describe the Arausio battle in vivid detail. The youth's dark eyes burned with ambition as he absorbed every tactical lesson, every mistake that had led to Roman defeat. His fingers unconsciously traced the hilt of his iron sword as visions of future glory filled his imagination.
"The Romans are not invincible,"
he whispered to himself, the words carrying promises that would echo through future decades.
"They bleed and die like any other men."
Around him, other young Gallic nobles murmured agreement, their conversations turning from Roman submission to dreams of independence that had seemed impossible only weeks before. Caepio's official report to the Senate arrived in Rome during the calends of December. Its carefully crafted phrases attempting to transform disaster into strategic withdrawal. The consul's scribes had worked for days to find language that would minimize his responsibility while maximizing his heroism in preserving what forces could be saved from inevitable destruction. The document landed on Scaurus's desk like a lead weight, its wax seals bearing the consulship's authority, but its contents reeking of political calculation. The old senator read each line with growing disgust, recognizing the lies wrapped in military jargon and legal terminology. Behind the flowery language lay the simple truth. Pride had divided Roman forces, and pride now sought to escape accountability. Tactical withdrawal to preserve strategic assets, Scaurus read aloud to his assembled clerks, his voice dripping with contempt. As if abandoning fellow citizens to slaughter was a calculated decision, rather than base cowardice. The younger scribes shifted uncomfortably, understanding that their master's anger could erupt at any moment. Outside the Senate House, Rome's streets buzzed with rumors and speculation as citizens tried to understand how 2 consular armies could simply vanish in the northern wilderness. Mothers clutched their children tighter, remembering stories their grandmothers told of Hannibal's approach and the terror that had gripped the city. History seemed to be repeating itself, but this time the enemy came from the north rather than the south. The Germanic tribes spent their winter months digesting the implications of their victory, as Boiorix had predicted they would. In smoky longhouses from the Rhine to the Danube, warriors retold the story of Arausio with growing embellishment, each version making the Romans weaker and the Germanic triumph more complete. Children played at being mighty warriors, defeating toy legions, while their mothers wove new banners for husbands who might not return from future battles. But experienced war chiefs like Boiorix understood that victory's aftermath was often more dangerous than defeat's consequences.
Roman merchants, who had traded freely in Germanic settlements, now avoided the northern territories entirely, their absence creating economic hardships that threatened tribal stability. Without Roman gold and goods, old rivalries resurged as clans competed for diminishing resources. The young men speak only of conquest, Boiorix confided to his chief during one of their private meetings in the sacred grove. Snow crunched under their feet as they walked among the ancient oaks, their breath visible in the frigid air. They believe Roman defeat means Roman weakness, but I remember stories of earlier wars when defeated legions returned, stronger than before. Boiorix nodded grimly, his pale eyes fixed on the horizon, where Roman territories lay beyond winter's veil. The captured eagle stood sentinel beside the grove's largest oak, its golden wings now tarnished by weather and time. It represented past victory, but also future challenges that would test his leadership and his people's unity. Spring's arrival brought disturbing news to Germanic settlements as Roman merchants gradually returned to frontier markets, their conversations filled with references to new armies gathering in Italia. Marius had accepted the Senate's emergency commission, and his reputation for military innovation sent shivers through even the bravest Germanic warriors. Unlike the aristocratic commanders who had fallen at Arausio, Marius understood that war was a profession requiring skill rather than breeding. Boiorix received these reports in his winter headquarters, a fortified settlement that had grown around the sacred grove where he had first planned his victory. The captured Roman eagle now stood in his great hall, surrounded by other trophies of war, but somehow dominating them all with its symbolic power. Tribal messengers arrived daily with news from across the Germanic Confederation, painting a picture of growing Roman preparations. Exhales sharply. They gather volunteers from throughout Italia, reported a scout who had penetrated deep into Roman territory. Old Marius promises land and citizenship to any man willing to serve 6 years in his legions. The training camps ring with hammer blows as smiths forge new weapons and armor. The man's weathered face showed the strain of his dangerous mission, but his information was invaluable. The Germanic chieftain studied his maps, marking Roman settlements and likely assembly points with small wooden tokens. Mathematics had never been his strength, but the numbers were clear. Rome's potential manpower dwarfed anything the Germanic Confederation could field. Victory at Arausio had been possible because the Romans divided their forces. Future battles would test Germanic courage against concentrated Roman might. Marius arrived in Rome during the Ides of Martius, his African campaigns having aged him but not diminished his legendary energy. At 62, he moved with the careful precision of a man whose body bore the scars of 40 years' warfare, yet his dark eyes still blazed with the intensity that had made him Rome's most feared general. Citizens lined the streets to watch his procession, hope mixing with desperation in their faces as they glimpsed salvation in military form. The Senate received him in emergency session, political differences temporarily set aside in the face of existential threat. Scaurus performed the introductions with grudging respect, acknowledging that circumstances demanded cooperation between former enemies. Maps of Gaul covered the chamber's floor, their markings showing the scope of the Germanic threat and the inadequacy of current Roman responses. The barbarians have tasted victory and grown bold, Marius observed, his gravelly voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. They will not repeat the mistake of dividing their forces, nor will they underestimate Roman resilience. This war will require new tactics, new training methods, and new types of soldiers willing to serve the Republic rather than personal ambition. His words carried implicit criticism of the aristocratic commanders who had led Rome to disaster. But none present dared challenge the man who represented their best hope for survival. Outside the Senate House, drums began beating the recruitment call as criers announced the formation of new legions under Marius's command. The recruitment camps outside Rome buzzed with activity as thousands of volunteers answered Marius's call to service. Unlike previous armies drawn from property-owning citizens, these new legions welcomed the urban poor and landless farmers who had previously been excluded from military service. The general's promise of land grants after completion of service attracted men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain from Roman victory. Young Marcus Valerius, son of a baker in the Subura district, stood in line with hundreds of other hopefuls as veteran centurions evaluated their fitness for military service. At 19, he possessed the strength of youth and the desperation of poverty, making him ideal material for Marius's revolutionary army. His calloused hands from years of kneading dough would soon learn to grip gladius and shield in defense of the Republic. The training that followed was unlike anything Rome had previously attempted. Marius stripped away traditional aristocratic privileges, making all soldiers equal before military law. Noble-born tribunes served alongside former slaves, while experienced centurions drilled recruits with merciless efficiency. The famous Marian mule emerged, soldiers who carried their own equipment and supplies, making armies faster and more self-sufficient. "Forget everything you think you know about warfare," shouted Centurion Brutus to his assembled recruits. "The barbarians killed 60,000 Romans who relied on tradition and breeding. We will defeat them with discipline, innovation, and the hunger of men fighting for their future rather than their ancestors' glory." As summer approached, disturbing reports reached Boiorix of massive Roman preparations throughout Italia and southern Gaul. Merchant spies brought word of new fortifications, supply depots, and training camps that spoke of systematic preparation rather than hasty response to crisis. The chieftain realized that his window of opportunity was closing as Rome marshaled resources that dwarfed anything the Germanic Confederation could match. Tribal unity, always fragile, began showing serious cracks as different clans pursued conflicting strategies. The Teutones, under old Ariovistus, favored returning to their traditional territories before Roman reinforcements arrived, while younger warriors demanded immediate attacks on Roman settlements, while fear still paralyzed their enemies. Boiorix found himself caught between conflicting pressures that threatened to tear his confederation apart. Annoyed, "We cannot fight Rome's full might with divided forces," he argued during yet another heated war council. Determined, "Either we unite for one massive assault, or we scatter to our homelands and await their vengeance separately." The captured Roman eagle stood behind him as he spoke, its presence a reminder of what Germanic unity had accomplished and what division might cost. But his words fell on increasingly deaf ears as tribal pride reasserted itself over common purpose. Victory at Arausio had been intoxicating, but its aftermath revealed the fundamental weakness of barbarian coalitions. Success bred arrogance, and arrogance destroyed cooperation. The chieftain watched his confederation unraveling and understood that time was running out for the Germanic cause. Caepio's return to Rome came not in triumph, but under cover of darkness, the disgraced consul slipping into the city like a thief avoiding justice. His senatorial rank protected him from immediate punishment, but whispers followed him through the streets like persistent shadows. Citizens who recognized his face turned away in disgust, their silence more damning than any formal accusation could have been. The Senate's formal inquiry began within days of his arrival, conducted with the solemn dignity that Roman law demanded, but everyone knew was mere theatre. Witnesses testified about the division between the two armies, the failure to coordinate defense, and the ultimate abandonment of Marcus's forces to Germanic fury. Each word added weight to charges that could result in exile or worse. "I preserved what forces could be saved," strained, Caepio repeated under oath, his aristocratic composure beginning to crack under relentless questioning. Strategic withdrawal prevented total disaster and allowed the army to fight another day. The legal phrases rang hollow in the marble chamber, and even senators sympathetic to his patrician background found themselves unable to defend such obvious cowardice. Scaurus delivered the final verdict with judicial calm that masked personal revulsion. Quintus Servilius Capio, you are found guilty of abandoning fellow citizens in battle and placing personal preservation above duty to the Republic. You are hereby stripped of consulship, exiled from Roman territories, and forbidden from bearing arms in service of the state. The sentence fell like a hammer blow, ending a political career built on noble blood and aristocratic privilege. Marius completed his military preparations as autumn painted the Gallic hills in shades of gold and crimson. His new legions had trained throughout the summer, transforming from desperate volunteers into disciplined fighting machines that bore little resemblance to the traditional Roman army. The soldiers carried standardized equipment, followed innovative tactics, and possessed a professional dedication that previous citizen armies had lacked. The march north began at the calends of October, 6 full legions moving with mechanical precision toward the Germanic territories. Unlike the divided command that had doomed earlier armies, Marius exercised absolute authority over every aspect of the campaign. His soldiers sang as they marched, their voices carrying across the countryside with confidence born of superior training and equipment. Young Marcus Valerius, now a seasoned legionnaire despite his months of service, shouldered his pack with practiced ease as his century took its place in the column. The baker's son had transformed into a Roman war machine, his muscles hardened by constant drill and his mind sharpened by tactical instruction. Around him, thousands of similar transformations had created an army unlike any Rome had fielded before. Today, we march to avenge our fallen comrades, commanding Marius announced to his assembled legions, his voice carrying across the ranks with practiced authority. The barbarians who butchered Roman citizens at Arausio will learn that Rome's vengeance is patient but inevitable. We go not for personal glory, but for the honor of the Republic itself. The Germanic Confederation's final war council convened as the first snows of winter began falling, crystalline flakes that seemed to carry omens of approaching doom. Boiorix stood before representatives of tribes that had once sworn eternal allegiance but now spoke openly of separate peace with Rome. The captured eagle remained at his side, but its symbolic power had faded as unity crumbled beneath the weight of competing ambitions. Marius approaches with 6 legions, reported the latest scout, his breath visible in the cold air of the council tent. They move like no Roman army we have seen before, faster, more disciplined, and completely under one commander's control. Our spies report new weapons, new tactics, and soldiers who fight for land rather than honor. The implications hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. Old Ariovistus rose from his seat with the dignity of approaching death, his weathered face bearing the weight of 7 decades. My people return to the Rhine valleys, he announced, his voice carrying finality that brooked no argument. The Teutones have won their victory and claimed their glory. Let younger men face Roman vengeance if they choose, but we withdraw to defend our ancestral lands. One by one, other tribal leaders followed Ariovistus's example, offering excuses that barely disguised their fear of Marius's approaching legions. By dawn, half the confederation had dissolved, leaving Boiorix with perhaps 20,000 warriors to face an enemy that had learned from previous mistakes and would not repeat them. The final battle began at dawn on the winter solstice, Marius having chosen the day for its symbolic significance. Darkness would not triumph over Roman light. His 6 legions deployed with mechanical precision across the frozen field, their new equipment glinting in the pale sunlight as thousands of hobnailed boots stamped warmth into numbed feet. The general himself rode along the lines, his scarred face showing calm confidence as he prepared to avenge Arausio's shame. Boiorix led his remaining warriors in a desperate charge across the ice-covered ground, their war cries echoing off the surrounding hills as they sought to break Roman discipline through pure ferocity. But these were not the same legions that had died at Arausio. Marius's soldiers stood firm behind locked shields, their pillar ready to gut any barbarian who came within range. The Germanic assault broke like waves against granite cliffs, Marian discipline proving superior to barbarian courage. Young Marcus Valerius found himself face to face with painted warriors whose fathers might have fought at Arausio, but his training held firm as his gladius found vital targets with mechanical efficiency. Around him, thousands of similar encounters played out as Roman professionalism met Germanic desperation. "Hold the line!" shouted centurions along the Roman front, their voices carrying over the din of combat. "Remember Arausio! Remember your fallen comrades!" The exhortations were unnecessary. These soldiers had trained for this moment, and their discipline held firm against every barbarian assault. Victory was no longer in doubt, only its completeness remained to be determined. Boiorix fell with a Roman pilum through his chest, the iron point punching through his ritual armor to find his heart. The Germanic chieftain's pale eyes looked up at the grey winter sky, perhaps seeing the same visions that had comforted Marcus at Arausio, ancestors welcoming him to the warrior's rest. Around him, his people's final charge broke against Roman steel like autumn leaves against winter wind. The captured eagle, symbol of his greatest triumph, lay trampled in the frozen mud as Marius's soldiers pressed their advantage. What had begun as revenge for Arausio became a systematic destruction of Germanic resistance, Roman discipline and superior equipment overwhelming barbarian courage and fury. The lessons learned from previous defeat now guided Rome to overwhelming victory. Marius himself reached the fallen chieftain's body, recognizing in death a worthy adversary who had taught Rome valuable lessons about the price of divided command. The general knelt beside Boiorix, showing the respect that one professional warrior owed another, before claiming the recovered eagle as proof of Roman vindication. "Let this end the Germanic threat for our generation," Marius declared, raising the reclaimed standard high above the battlefield's carnage. "Rome has learned from defeat and emerged stronger. Our enemies will remember this day when they consider challenging the Republic's might." The surviving Germanic warriors fled north toward their homelands, carrying news of disaster that would echo through barbarian councils for decades to come. The news of Marius's victory reached Rome as the city celebrated Saturnalia, transforming winter festivities into spontaneous triumph. Citizens who had lived with fear since Arausio poured into the streets, their voices raised in thanksgiving to gods who had finally answered Roman prayers. Temple priests worked overtime conducting sacrifices, while merchants opened their best wine to celebrate the return of Roman military supremacy. In the Senate House, even Marius's political enemies acknowledged the magnitude of his achievement. The Germanic Confederation, that had seemed poised to march on Rome itself, lay shattered, its warriors scattered and its leadership dead. The threat that had kept senators awake at night for 2 years had been eliminated by professional competence and military innovation. Old Scarus, now approaching his 80th year, rose slowly to address the celebration. His weathered voice carried clearly through the chamber as he spoke words that would be remembered long after the participants were dust. "Citizens of Rome, we have learned that military disasters can become military innovations when guided by wisdom rather than pride. Let future generations remember both Arausio and its redemption. The captured eagle, restored to its sacred place among the legion's standards, gleamed in the temple's lamplight as priests performed purification rituals. Its golden wings had witnessed both Rome's greatest shame and its redemptive triumph, serving as a reminder that the Republic's strength lay not in avoiding defeat, but in learning from it. Years passed, and the valley of Arausio returned to peaceful obscurity, its fields once again growing grain rather than nurturing corpses. Shepherds grazed their flocks where Roman legions had died, and traders used the old battlefield as just another stop on commercial routes connecting Gaul with the Mediterranean world. Nature had healed the scars of human folly, but memory lingered in places where survivors gathered to share their stories. An old veteran, named Gaius Metellus, one of the few men who had escaped the original disaster, returned to the valley as part of his final pilgrimage before death. His weathered hands traced the outline of long-vanished earthworks, while his rheumy eyes searched for landmarks that existed now only in memory. The sacred grove where Boiorix had planned his victory stood empty, its druids scattered, and its ancient rituals forgotten. Here stood the eagle, he whispered to his grandson, pointing to an unremarkable patch of grass where Marcus had made his final stand. Here your ancestors bled and died for Rome, and here they were avenged by better men who learned from their sacrifice. The young man listened respectfully, understanding that he heard living history from one of its last witnesses. The wind stirred the grass where so many had fallen, carrying no echoes of ancient battle cries or death songs. Time had transformed catastrophe into lesson, defeat into wisdom, and the Valley of Arausio into merely another chapter in Rome's long story of learning through blood and recovering through determination. The ancient stones remember what mortal men choose to forget, holding in their silent depths the echoes of that terrible autumn when Roman pride met Germanic fury in the Valley of Arausio. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the lessons of that distant battle settle into your dreams like autumn leaves finding rest upon still waters. In those final moments before slumber claims you, remember that even the mightiest empires learn their greatest lessons through their most devastating defeats. Thoughtful. The eagles that fell at Arausio taught Rome that unity serves better than division, that professional skill surpasses noble birth, and that wisdom can emerge from the ashes of catastrophe when pride steps aside for pragmatic truth. The Germanic warriors who died in those northern woods fought for land and freedom, their courage burning bright as winter stars before fading into the eternal darkness that claims all mortal ambitions. Their chieftain, Boiorix, found honor in death, while their victor Marius found wisdom in their example, transforming Roman warfare for generations yet to come. Let the wind through your window carry whispers of ancient voices, speaking across the centuries of courage and cowardice, triumph and disaster, the eternal dance of human folly and human wisdom. In dreams, you might hear the distant sound of bronze trumpets calling legions to formation, or the deeper notes of Germanic horns summoning clans to their final destiny. Sleep now, knowing that the lessons carved in blood upon autumn ground still guide those who would learn from history's harsh instruction. The Valley of Arausio sleeps beneath peaceful stars, its terrible secrets transformed into quiet wisdom for those who listen to the stories written in ancient stone and whispered by the patient wind through autumn grass. Rest well, traveler through time's deep mysteries. Rest well.